Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, we're going to be talking about comic studies, grief, memory, and how all that can be combined into a pretty special piece of creative nonfiction. Joining me on this 4-episode series, which is brought to you with generous support from the Wilfrid Laurier University Press, is Dr. Dale Jacobs, a professor of English at the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, and the author of several books, including his latest, On Comics and Grief. The title is a hybrid of scholarship, memoir, nostalgia, and grief over the recent death of the author's mother. It's an encapsulation of how researchers are allowing personal experiences to inform their scholarship and guide the ways in which it is presented. In this second episode of our series, Dale and I take a deeper dive into comic studies, as well as some of the main findings of his book. I want to again, ask you about sort of the cross-section of comics from different publishers that you selected and sort of your intentions behind that. I mean, were you looking for, obviously it sounds like you were looking at, how they approached their various themes, their how they, the artwork that comes into play, and maybe sort of the historical factors that they focused on. But maybe if you could just kind of get into a little bit more detail about that cross-section for us.
Yeah, so I thought if I was looking at a typical year, I needed to have something from every possible genre.
Right.
That was immediately, I knew that there had to be superhero comics, but I also had to have war comics and romance comics and kids comics. And
Why make it easy on yourself?
yeah, it needed to be everything that's being read. I include Cracked, so a humor magazine, for example. And I include teen comics like Archie. So I wanted they used to be called sword and sandals, fantasy comics, like Conan is one. So I knew I wanted to have every genre, but at the same time, I knew that I had to have something from every publisher, and it had to be sort of balanced. There's a couple more from Marvel and DC, but I also knew that I needed to have Charlton Comics covered. And with Charlton, I do romance comics, but I also do one of remember Emergency, the television show from the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So they had both a comic, but what I focus on is the black and white magazine. Charlton never gets studied. So that was part of it. I wanted to look at these comics and at this company that's usually just dismissed.
Yeah.
Harvey Comics absolutely for kids, Richie Rich and Casper the Friendly Ghost. I wanted to look at those because I think that's an understudied kind of comics, or kids comics.
Mm-hmm.
So I made sure that there's at least one comic from every company. And I think Fawcett is the only one that it's a single, and that's Dennis the Menace. That's all they were publishing by that point.
Okay.
But every other company has more than one comic, and every genre is represented. And that was important to me. If I'm going to look at a year, I have to look at really what does that year look like in all its sort of permutations.
What was in the back of your mind? Like, were you did you have expectations, or were you just sort of compiling all of these different comics from these different publishers, and then you'll see what you see, and then kind of select what you were going to focus on from that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it took me so long to figure out what this was going to look like.
Right.
So I finished reading everything. It took me forever to collect it. So I own almost everything in physical copies, except if it was prohibitively expensive. There's a few things that were just, I wasn't going to pay $300 for an issue.
Of course.
So I paid, $2, $3, $4 for almost everything. So I collected it, and then I read it, and then I think I was reading it in 15, 16. I was starting to try to figure out what this might look like.
Mm-hmm.
And I For me, I have to figure out the organizational structure,
Right.
and then that lets me start writing whatever book I'm doing, or even article. I have to figure out the general structure, and then things start to slot into place. And I couldn't quite figure it out. I knew I wanted to do a year. I knew I wanted to have a couple comics for each month. And my notebook has lots of different permutations of what that looks like. I knew I always wanted to cover all the genres and all the publishers, but then what does that look like? How does that
Yeah.
translate? And it wasn't until I decided exactly on what I was doing with structure that it all fell into place.
Mm-hmm.
And I still used a lot of the comics I'd noted before, but some other ones slotted in instead when it became clear what I was finally doing with the book.
Right. Excellent. Okay, so we can look at some specifics in that regard about the book. So, for example, in the March chapter, you highlight a DC comic. It's a first issue special that features a new hero, Starman, and you note the importance of costuming as it relates to establishing setting and character. And the issue has a notable artistic design quality that is befitting of a debut issue. World building plays an integral part as well. Can you tie all that in with how publishers use those qualities to drive sales, and how memories of your mother became infused with this chapter?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to do like one of the tryout books. Like both Marvel and DC had these kind of tryout books.
Yeah.
See if it sticks, see if anybody is interested in the character, and then can we spin a series off.
Hmm.
DC seemed like first issue special seemed like the best one. I initially picked this because of the cover and because of the art, and I thought there's things I can do here. The world building is interesting, so I slotted it in, and it was one of those instances where I could think about how DC and how the creators are trying to offer something to the readers. And there's at the end, they ask for reader feedback. And so there's all these interesting, what we call paratextual, the elements that surround the text, all these places to ask for reader feedback. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in how they build the world. But I'm also starting to think at this point about mom as a person and her interest in sewing and in fashion. And so I'm thinking about that with the creative nonfiction part of it. And it made me start to think about it in terms of it's the costuming that's important
Mm.
in this. And it really is. And I may have got to that without thinking about mom, but that's really what drove me there. And it led me, there's a lot of people do work on costuming, especially in superhero comics, on costuming. So it
Right.
led me to their work and to a way of approaching comics I wouldn't have necessarily used. And pulling on that other kind of interdisciplinary quality that I think enriches the chapter, and it lets me sort of weave together what I'm doing in Memories of Mom and her sewing, and later in the book I sort of think about what if with her, and that has to do with fashion, so I'm able to do some callbacks to what was happening here.
Hmm.
um, and I think it was actually this chapter and a couple of the others that made me, because this is early, it's March, these started, and I wrote everything in order. This chapter and the previous chapter really started to help me think about how I was integrating what I was writing about mom and about losing her and about her life with my approach to the comics.
Right. And so, just to contextualize this real quick, um, your mother passed away.
2013.
Right. So you were just before you kind of really got into this project, right?
Yeah, and in fact, I write about in the introduction, I was at her deathbed as I was having to do the page proofs for the
Right.
first book, and
Hmm.
part of this book to me is about how, and it's not just academics, it's how we're all asked to just keep moving on. Doesn't matter what's happening in our lives, we have to keep going. And
Hmm.
that's instilled in us as academics from undergraduate on, certainly from grad school on. You just put aside everything else and you get on with what you're doing. And
Yeah.
I was thinking back, I was very struck. It didn't seem odd to me at the time, but I was struck by that, and that's why the book opens in that way.
Right. Right. Um, so as we mentioned earlier, the year 1976 was also a time where publishers seemed to emphasize or expand on certain features of comics to
Yeah.
increase sales and readership. As we just talked about, art, costuming, world building, but also serializing, which is not necessarily a new concept at that time. But can you talk about some of the tactics you noticed publishers using, during this time to expand their market? Um, and maybe going back to, you explained in the last episode that publishers were in trouble in 1976.
Yeah.
What was going on at that time?
Yeah, so we were just talking about first issue specials. So things like the tryout books.
Right.
That's a low cost way to see if an idea is going to fly.
Hmm.
So things like that. Using events like the bicentennial. So Marvel, almost every company had some comics that tied into the bicentennial because that obviously was the biggest event happening in America at the time. But Marvel really went all in. They had lots of different comics that celebrated the bicentennial. They had uh, their calendar for the year was all bicentennial themed. It was all the superheroes inserted into patriotic painting, crossing the Delaware, and all of those kinds of things. So events like that, the Olympics. Dennis the Menace has an Olympic issue, so some of that happening. Partnerships with things like Major League Baseball. Harvey has a comic called Richie Rich, Casper, and Wendy Salute the National League. So you get these kind of tie-ins that happen.
Hmm.
There's a famous Treasury oversized comic called Spider-Man versus Superman. That's the two companies, Marvel and DC, putting this thing out together because it's more important to start with that you get people back to reading comics, and then you can sort of dice up who has what.
Yeah.
But you get that kind of inner company collaboration that you don't normally see. Merchandise, you get a lot of merch tie-ins. DC gives away a Superman belt buckle if you collect all of these different comics. You get things like record albums from Marvel, and Portrait of a Superhero is one they did, and Harvey Comics. So different kinds of merchandise. Uh, Lots of different genres. They're still trying to see which genres are going to sell. So every company still has as many genres as possible. Especially Marvel and DC are publishing everything. Harvey has retreated just to kids comics. I think
Hmm.
the last issue of a teenage comic is out, but they've retreated. Every company is doing different things. Harvey is that focus. Marvel and DC is let's try every genre. Marvel is still publishing, for example, war comics and romance comics. It's all reprints, though. They seem to feel like, as a strategy, we just need to put volume out on the
Right.
stand.
Right.
So every company is doing something slightly different. With serialization, I really noticed that there's a comic called Marvel Team Up. It was Spider-Man and then a different guest star every month. And if you read the letters columns, the readers had started to complain that every issue felt exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so what the creators did and the editors, they responded and said, okay, we've heard you. We're going to start essentially creating serialized stories. So it doesn't feel like the same issue every month, that this story builds. And it's much more interesting
Mm-hmm.
when you read those comics. And so that's one example too of the publishers responding to the readers, because they know they have to.
Right.
So there's a lot of different kinds of strategies going on with the different companies.
Yeah. Yeah, I can remember I used to read comics too back in middle school and high school, and I can remember like for the X-Men, for example, um, they would spin off a series on individual superheroes that
Yep.
were normally part of a group. Wolverine, for example, and there's this, origin stories or just separate adventures that they were having. And so, yeah, there was still, I think, some of that going on in the 80s and 90s, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, in the September chapter, and I think this is where a little bit more of the creative nonfiction comes in. It's fascinating because you weave in a conference proposal and later excerpts of your talk about how comics publishers in 1976 represented and incorporated the American bicentennial, as we just talked about. You're essentially splicing your narration of your memories of giving the talk with the talk itself. It's hard to kind of explain that without seeing it in front of you, but
Yeah.
um, can you describe how you structured this chapter, and what you were kind of hoping the reader would take away from that?
Yeah, I guess let me talk first of all about the whole book.
Yeah.
I'm really trying to play with form in the whole book. So, approaching it and combining scholarship with creative nonfiction, first of all. And it's a fragmented text, and it's meant to mimic what comics do in terms of fragments. Barbara Postma calls comics the art of fragments. And so this book is my attempt to mimic that.
Hmm.
So we have it's all fairly short sections, will be comic scholarship and creative nonfiction, and then all the quotations, whether it's from grief memoir or about nostalgia or comic scholars, those are all pulled into their own section. So I never do anything like as X says and then talk about, those are all pulled out. So it's all fragmented to start with. And this was one other strategy to try to just play with what an academic text can be,
Hmm.
I think.
Right.
And it's also, it took a long time to figure out what this book would be, but that chapter is that paper that was my first foray into doing something with 1976. The first thing I did was I had noticed the stuff about the bicentennial, and so I did this conference paper, and that was in about, I think, 2015. And as academics, we always convert conference papers to articles. And I had
Mm.
meant to do that for a long time. And I could never bring myself to do it. I could never figure out exactly what I wanted to say. And that was also, I think, related to what I was doing with the whole project. So I knew I had these two comics on the bicentennial, and I was going to write about it. And I had originally thought I would do it like every other chapter, going back and forth between creative nonfiction and the analysis and different ways of using comic scholarship.
Yep.
But then it just struck me, I've got a conference paper, and the most honest thing to do is actually to use that conference paper to talk about how I couldn't convert it, and then to insert what I'm thinking at the time as a way to also get at how we present conference papers.
Hmm.
So, this whole book for me is a lot about pulling aside the curtain of what happens in our professional lives, how they're not completely separate from our personal lives. And I try to get to that in a lot of different ways, and this was one strategy, I think, to do that.
Right. Yeah, I'm just realizing this isn't dissimilar to what you frequently encounter in comics themselves, where, as you mentioned, I think it's part of the paratext, where the publishers or the editors will literally
Yep.
pause and like ask the reader or address the reader in some way, directly.
Yeah.
So that's
Definitely. This is, that idea of being self-reflexive, and
yeah.
I want constantly the reader to think about form and to think about what's being done. If you read an academic argument, just like if you read a narrative, you can just get lost in the narrative or lost in the argument.
Sure.
And I want them to not, because I'm constantly asking people to shift gears as they read, and that's intentional.
You just heard from Dr. Dale Jacobs, an English professor at the University of Windsor and author of the recent book on comics and grief. This episode was brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when Dale and I talk about the more personal aspects of his title, including how he entwines his scholarship with memories of his mother and father, and why he feels personal experience should definitely be a part of the research and writing process. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.